Why had she stayed so quiet? That was the first question that lingered in the minds of those who watched her sit in the waiting room, her left arm bound in a sling, bandages tightening her ribs, face pale beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. Others shifted, complained, asked for updates. She said nothing, just sat there, silent, still, watching. Sarah Martinez had been waiting for 3 hours. She could feel the ache in her ribs every time she breathed, the dull burn in her shoulder from the surgery. But she didn't move, didn't ask for help. Complaining wasn't something she did anymore. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been dangling 20 feet in the air on a training rope that wasn't supposed to snap. But it did. She hit the ground hard. Bones cracked, pain screamed, blood streaked down her forehead. And still, when the others rushed to her side, she had waved them away, insisting she was fine. Fine, that word. She always used it, as if her body's fractures and her mind's quiet storms could be reduced to something that small. The truth was she had never been fine, not really. Growing up in Texas, in that small town no one ever left, Sarah had learned that invisibility was safer than confrontation. Her 3 older brothers were loud, reckless, always demanding attention. She had been the quiet shadow at the dinner table, the girl who slipped away before tempers flared, who knew that when her father drank, which was most nights, the only safe place was behind her bedroom door with a book in her lap. Stories about far-off places, about heroes who never hesitated, about courage she wished she had. Her family expected her to stay in the background, nursing, maybe teaching. That was what her guidance counselor suggested. Soft-spoken girls belonged in safe jobs, but Sarah had other plans. Joining the army had stunned everyone. She wanted to test herself, to push against the limits of who they thought she was. Basic training nearly broke her. The shouting, the endless drills, the pressure. Some recruits cried, others fought back. Sarah didn't do either, she just absorbed it, like she always had, silent, enduring, unyielding. It unsettled the others at first, this girl who never shouted back, never broke down, never let the screaming drill sergeants see her crack. But by the end of those weeks, they realized something. The quiet ones weren't always weak. Sometimes silence was steel. She earned her place in the 82nd Airborne Division working logistics. Not glamorous, not what you saw in the movies, but it mattered. Soldiers needed supplies, gear, ammunition, and Sarah made sure it was there. On time, every time. And still, despite the long hours and the respect of her sergeant, she remained invisible. That was her way. Blend in, keep her head down, do the work. Until the accident. Now sitting in that hospital waiting room, she could feel eyes on her for the first time, noticing her silence, her patience, her posture straight-backed even in pain. They didn't know what she carried inside. The nurse finally called her name. Sarah stood carefully, her body stiff but disciplined. She followed down the hall, past posters plastered with slogans about service and sacrifice. She knew those words, but they felt distant, like something written for someone else. The exam room was small, sterile. A single window overlooked the parade ground where soldiers drilled in formation, every step sharp, precise. Sarah watched them through the glass, thinking about how far behind she was falling. Before the accident, she'd been preparing for promotion exams, hungry for advancement. Now she was stuck, healing slower than she wanted, trapped in stillness. The door opened, she straightened, expected the same doctor who had treated her before, but the man who stepped inside was different. Camouflage fatigues, confident walk, the insignia on his chest, Navy SEAL medic. She froze for just a second. She never met a SEAL before. They belonged to another world, a world of whispered stories and shadowed missions. He introduced himself, petty officer, calm, steady voice, no arrogance, just presence. He was here temporarily, he said, recovering from his own injury, a shoulder torn open by shrapnel. Sarah nodded but kept silent, waiting, watching. What she didn't realize then, not yet, was that this meeting would change everything. Had seen hundreds of injured soldiers, Some groaned, others joked, most covered fear with bravado. But not this one. This one sat with her back straight, face calm, answering his questions with the smallest words possible. Her medical file was brief but telling. Pain tolerance off the charts, minimal requests for medication, repeated attempts to return to duty before her body was ready. Still, something about her didn't fit. Her build, her grip strength, the calluses on her hands, too much for a logistics specialist, too precise, too controlled. He began asking questions, not just about her injuries, about her background, training, goals. She answered evenly, but he saw it, the flickers in her expression when he touched too close to truth. Then he noticed the manual she'd been reading in the waiting room. Not logistics, not standard field training, tactical medicine, advanced, restricted. Why would she have that? He pressed gently. She deflected. He told stories of his own deployments, watching her reactions. A slight change in breathing when he mentioned reconnaissance. A tiny lean forward when he described advanced trauma care. And when he dropped the name of a classified training site in Virginia, just casually, just a test, her eyes widened. For half a second. Then she caught herself. He knew she wasn't what her records said. Finally, as she rose to leave, sling tucked close, her hand on the door, he asked it. Where did you really learn to tie a Prussic knot with your non-dominant hand while under stress? The words hit her like a punch. She froze, heartbeat sharp in her ears. That technique wasn't in basic training, wasn't in logistics school. It was whispered knowledge, taught only in places no one admitted existed. How did he know? Her cover had held for years, every answer rehearsed, every movement disciplined. But now, in one question, he'd found her crack. Sarah turned slowly, searching his face, weighing choices. Deny, deflect, lie. She'd been trained to protect the program above all else. Silence had kept her safe this long. And yet his eyes weren't prying. They weren't cruel. They were steady, patient, as if he knew exactly what it cost her to stand there, caught between duty and truth. She swallowed hard, finally spoke. I can't discuss my training background. Her voice low, calm, carrying a quiet finality. Then softer, but I can tell you your observation skills are sharp, for a medic. Not confession, not surrender, but acknowledgement, enough. For the first time, nodded, slowly, he understood. She wasn't what she seemed, and she had just chosen to trust him, if only by a fraction. Sarah felt a strange relief wash over her, but also fear, because if he knew this much, how long before others did? The silence stretched between them, heavy, alive. And for the first time in years, she wondered if her secrets were finally catching up to her. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her barracks room, replaying his question over and over. That knot. That one word had cracked open 3 years of silence. She had survived by being invisible, by playing her role so perfectly that no one ever looked deeper. A logistics specialist. Quiet, reliable, unremarkable. The kind of soldier you trusted to get the paperwork done, not the kind you suspected of carrying secrets too dangerous to say out loud. But had seen through her in minutes. Sarah turned her head on the pillow, her injured shoulder burning. She thought about his eyes, steady, patient, not hostile. He hadn't asked out of arrogance or to trap her. It was curiosity, professional, maybe even protective. Still, it left her with a problem. If he knew enough to ask about that knot, what else might he guess? And how far could she go before her silence became a liability? She pressed her bandaged ribs with her good hand and forced herself to breathe. This was why they drilled her. Why her handler had told her, over and over, that cover was life. That secrets mattered more than feelings. That even a flicker of hesitation could cost everything. Yet when she closed her eyes, she didn't see the accident. She didn't hear the snap of the rope or feel the ground slam into her. She heard his voice, calm, low, asking that impossible question. Where did you really learn? The next morning was already in the hospital wing, reviewing her chart. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't push right away. He let her settle. When he finally spoke, his tone was careful. "How's the pain today?" "Manageable," she said. Always the same answer, always understated. "Sleep. Enough." He made notes. His expression gave away nothing. But then he asked almost casually, "Any dizziness, numbness in the hand?" Sarah's chest tightened. He'd noticed. She hadn't told anyone. The nerve damage was subtle, something she'd been hiding, something she couldn't afford to admit. If the wrong officer knew, they'd ground her, maybe permanently. She hesitated too long. He glanced up. Their eyes met, and she realized something. He already knew the answer. Her silence was enough. For the first time since the accident, she felt cornered, not by an interrogator, not by a commander, but by a medic who seemed determined to treat the wounds she wasn't allowed to name. "Your records don't tell the whole story," he said finally, voice quiet. "They never do, but I can read patterns, and yours don't add up." Her pulse quickened. She wanted to deflect, to retreat into her rehearsed lines, but exhaustion weighed on her, heavier than the sling, heavier than the bandages. She was tired of pretending her body wasn't screaming. So instead of denial, she whispered the smallest truth she could risk. There were complications. Didn't react, didn't press. He simply closed the file and leaned back slightly, studying her like a puzzle he wasn't rushing to solve. "Then let's deal with them," he said, "but not here, too many ears." Her breath caught. Not here. That meant he wasn't just guessing. He had clearances, access. He was offering her something no one else had. She swallowed. "Why?" "Because," he said simply, "your body deserves the truth, and so do you." That evening, Sarah followed his instructions, slipping into a secure facility tucked deep within the base. The air inside was different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew they were meant to hold secrets. White noise hummed faintly, drowning out anything that might be listening. Was already there, sitting at a metal table strewn with manuals and equipment. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Respect. Not for her rank or her cover, but for the fact that she had come. She sat. The silence between them was sharp, waiting. Began slowly. He told her about his own background, about Task Force 160, about the missions no one admitted on record. He spoke not like a man boasting, but like someone laying down proof of trust. Piece by piece, he showed her that he understood what it meant to live with secrets too heavy to carry alone. Only when his story was finished did he gesture toward her. "Your turn. Tell me what the doctors don't know." Her throat tightened. Years of training screamed against it, but then she thought about the numbness in her hand, the dizzy spells, the damage she was hiding, the way her body was betraying her even as she clung to silence. She closed her eyes, inhaled carefully against the pain in her ribs, and spoke. "The rope didn't just fail. I was carrying equipment, not standard issue. It drove into my side when I fell, internal bruising, maybe nerve damage. I couldn't put that in the report." When she opened her eyes again, he was watching her, not with suspicion, not with judgment, just steady focus. "What symptoms?" She listed them quietly: tingling, loss of grip strength, dizziness, weakness. Each word felt like pulling teeth, but once spoken there was no taking them back. Wrote notes methodically, then nodded once. "That's treatable, painful but treatable, and you'll need someone who understands the circumstances. I can do that." For a long moment she just stared at him. A SEAL medic volunteering to carry a piece of her secret. It felt impossible. "Why would you risk it?" she asked finally. His answer was simple: "Because your mission isn't worth anything if you're broken." Her chest tightened. The words landed heavier than he could have known. She had built her life on sacrifice, on enduring, on pretending she wasn't broken, even when she was. And here was this man telling her she didn't have to keep carrying it alone. She looked down at her bandaged hands, silent again. But this time the silence wasn't about hiding. It was about deciding. For the first time in years, she considered the possibility that trusting someone might not be weakness. It might be survival. Over the next weeks, their meetings became routine, always in the secure room, always careful, treated her with precision, his hands steady, his instructions clear. But it wasn't just medical. In those sessions, he asked questions no one else ever had, about her life before, about why she chose silence, about what drove her to keep pushing long after most soldiers would have collapsed. At first she resisted. She gave short answers, guarded words, but slowly something shifted. One evening, as he worked pressure points along her spine, she found herself speaking before she could stop. "Noise was dangerous," she whispered. He paused. "Noise." "My father," she said, her voice cracked, but she kept going. "When he drank, you stayed quiet, you disappeared. That was how you survived." Didn't interrupt, didn't pity her, he simply listened. And that, more than anything, broke something open inside her. For years she had carried silence as armor, in training, in missions, in life. But with him in that secure room, silence was no longer armor, it was space. Space to breathe, to finally speak. She told him about Texas, about her brothers, about the books she hid behind, about why invisibility had always felt safer than being seen. When her words faltered, shared his own. Stories of growing up in a military family, of the weight of expectation, of pushing himself into danger because he thought that was the only way to prove his worth. Two soldiers, different paths, the same hunger, to be seen but not exposed, to be strong but not consumed. And in that strange, sterile room, under the hum of white noise, they began to find something neither had expected: connection. One evening, after a particularly difficult treatment session, Sarah sat on the edge of the table, sweat glistening along her hairline, her hand trembling from pain. Handed her water and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. She frowned. "What?" "Someone who carries the weight of secrecy so tightly it's crushing her." She blinked, startled. No one had ever said it out loud. Everyone else praised her discipline, her silence, her composure. No one had dared to call it what it was: a burden. She tried to deflect. "It's necessary." "Maybe," he said, "but necessary doesn't mean healthy." The words hit harder than any physical pain. For the first time, she wondered if silence had protected her or imprisoned her. She didn't answer, couldn't. The room felt heavy with truth, and for once she didn't try to escape it. As the weeks passed, her body began to heal. The numbness eased. Her strength returned. She moved closer to clearance for duty. But something else had changed, too. The sessions weren't just about recovery anymore. They were about trust, about learning what it meant to share the weight of secrets without fear of betrayal. Sarah knew it was dangerous. Personal attachments weren't just discouraged in her world, they were liabilities, weak points, vulnerabilities. She had been trained to cut them out before they ever formed. And yet, every time she sat across from him in that silent room, she felt the lines she had drawn begin to blur. One evening, when he brushed his fingers lightly over her injured shoulder, testing range of motion, she felt her breath catch. Not from pain, from something else, something she had buried for years. She pulled back quickly, hiding it, but he saw, of course he saw. Neither of them said a word. But the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of secrets anymore. It was the silence of something waiting. Something neither of them was ready to name. The first time she sensed it, it was just a flicker, a shadow in the background she couldn't quite shake. Sarah had been walking back to her barracks after a session with the night air cool against her face, when she felt it, the weight of unseen eyes. She slowed her steps, listened. Nothing obvious, just the hum of lights over the parade ground, the faint shuffle of another soldier in the distance. Ordinary sounds. and yet her instincts screamed. She had lived 3 years in shadows, and instincts never lied. By the time she reached her door, she knew they were watching. Of course they were. Her handler had warned her. Deep cover didn't mean freedom. It meant surveillance from both sides, enemies and allies alike. That night Sarah lay awake again, her mind racing. Had she said too much trusted too quickly, or had her superiors already noticed the pattern of her meetings? She wanted to believe the secure room gave her safety, but safety was a myth. Everything was observed, judged, and if they thought she was compromising, they would pull her from the program, without explanation, without warning. Her ribs ached as she turned over. She told herself to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Colonel Hayes had been reading the reports for weeks. She sat in her office, glasses low on her nose, scrolling through data she knew wasn't supposed to exist. Surveillance logs, psychological metrics, performance evaluations. Sarah Martinez, PFC, logistics specialist, cover identity. But the numbers told another story. Since the accident, Sarah's stress indicators had dropped. Decision-making speed had improved. Even her recovery time was ahead of projections. The anomaly was clear. Her interactions with were stabilizing her, not distracting her. Hayes tapped her pen against the desk. It was unusual. Operatives weren't supposed to form attachments. Attachments created leverage, vulnerability, the kind of cracks adversaries exploited. And yet Sarah was thriving. Hayes leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe, she thought, they had underestimated the value of connection. Maybe silence had kept Sarah alive, but it was who was making her stronger. The colonel wasn't ready to intervene. Not yet, but she would be watching closely. For Sarah, the days bled together. Training she wasn't cleared for yet, physical therapy sessions she hated, and nights where she returned again and again to that sterile, humming secure room. Never rushed her, never more than necessary, but his presence was steady, anchoring her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Sometimes their conversations were technical, medical procedures, therapy exercises, mission cover stories that didn't quite match her injuries. Sometimes, though, they drifted into dangerous territory, the personal. One night, after a particularly grueling therapy session, broke the silence. "You ever wonder if you made the right choice?" he asked. She frowned. "Choice? This life, the one that eats everything, family, friends, normalcy." Her instinct was to answer the way she always did. Discipline, duty, service, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "It wasn't a choice, not really." He tilted his head, watching her. "What do you mean?" Sarah stared at the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of us were shaped for this before we ever put on the uniform. Noise was dangerous. Silence was survival. Missions, they're just another form of disappearing." The admission felt heavier than anything she had told him before. For a moment, the room felt too quiet, too exposed. But didn't press. He just nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected. And for the first time, Sarah realized he understood, not just the soldier part, the human part, the broken child part. That scared her more than anything. The next morning, she was called to her handler's office. Colonel Hayes sat behind her desk, expression unreadable. Sarah snapped to attention, heart pounding. "At ease," Hayes said. Sarah lowered her arms but stayed rigid, waiting. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then spoke. "How's your recovery?" "Progressing, ma'am." "Pain?" "Manageable." Hayes narrowed her eyes. "You've been spending a lot of time with petty officer." The words landed like a blade. Sarah forced her face into stillness. "He's been assisting with therapy." "That's all?" "Yes, ma'am." Hayes leaned back, hands steepled. "You know the rules. Attachment is vulnerability. You've been trained better than to forget that." Sarah's pulse raced. "Understood, ma'am." For a moment, silence filled the office. Then Hayes sighed almost softly. "You're stronger now than you were before the accident. That's clear. I don't care why. I care that it continues. Don't make me regret giving you this much freedom." Sarah saluted, turned, and left. Her hands were steady, but inside her chest felt like it was splitting open. Freedom, that was the word Hayes used, but Sarah knew what it really meant. She was on a leash, and someone was watching how tightly she pulled against it. That night she told, not everything, not the details, just enough. "They know," she whispered. He didn't look surprised. "Of course they do." Her eyes snapped to his. "Then why keep meeting?" "Because," he said simply, "if they haven't stopped us yet, it means they're curious. They're seeing what happens." She stared at him, stunned. "We're a test." He shrugged. "Maybe, but tests can change rules. You've seen it. So have I." She shook her head, anger flaring. "You don't understand. In my world, tests don't end well. If they decide I'm compromised, I disappear." Skaze didn't waver. "Then don't give them a reason." It was reckless advice, maybe even dangerous, and yet she couldn't ignore the calm in his tone, the steadiness of it. She had lived her life fearing exposure, but was daring her to live despite it. And part of her, the part that had been buried since childhood, wanted to believe him. Weeks passed. Sarah's body grew stronger. The dizziness eased, the grip in her hand returned. Her official records showed steady recovery, nothing unusual. But inside that secure room, something else was happening. Trust, connection. The kind of quiet bond forged not through words but through survival. One night, after he finished adjusting the sling on her shoulder, lingered a moment too long. His hand brushed hers just lightly. She didn't pull away. The silence between them deepened, heavier, charged. She turned her head, met his eyes. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that single point. Two soldiers, each carrying secrets, each trained to keep distance. And yet here, in this sterile, guarded room, they were closer than either had been to anyone in years. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to step back, to retreat into discipline, but her body betrayed her, leaning just slightly toward him. The moment passed. He cleared his throat, stepped away, professional again, but she knew he had felt it too. And that terrified her more than any mission ever had. Far away, in a quiet operations center, Colonel Hayes received another report. The data was undeniable. Martinez's stress levels were the lowest they had ever recorded. Her recovery metrics were beyond expectation. Her operational readiness was climbing faster than predicted. And all of it tied to one variable. Hayes tapped her fingers on the table, deep in thought. Maybe this wasn't a liability after all. Maybe it was an asset. She drafted a message to her superiors, carefully worded, deliberately vague. Recommend further observation of Martinez dynamic, potential operational model. Then she hit send. Sarah didn't know it yet, didn't either, but their connection, fragile and unspoken, had already shifted from a personal risk to a professional experiment. And somewhere above them, decisions were being made. Decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. Sarah had been trained to spot patterns, in conversations, in logistics, in people, and lately the patterns were impossible to ignore. The nurse at the desk who always glanced a little too long when she checked in. The way schedule never seemed to conflict with hers. The subtle presence of soldiers she didn't recognize stationed near the corridors when she left the secure room. It was surveillance, polite, invisible to most, but she could feel it pressing at the edges, watching, measuring. One night, after a session that left her shoulder throbbing, Sarah lingered in the secure room while packed away equipment. "They're watching us," she said. He didn't even look up. "I know." The calmness in his voice startled her. "And you're not worried?" "I've spent my whole career being watched," he said, tucking papers into a folder. "Command wants to know how we operate under pressure. It's nothing new." Sarah shook her head. "This isn't the same. In my world, being watched doesn't mean evaluation. It means judgment. And judgment, she trailed off. The weight of unfinished words pressed against her chest. Judgment means what? He asked quietly. She met his eyes. For a second she let herself say it. Judgment means termination. The silence after hung like smoke. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just closed the folder and said, "Then let's give them something they can't terminate." Colonel Hayes read the transcript from the observation team later that week. The words confirmed what she had suspected. Sarah was fully aware she was being monitored, but instead of shutting down, she was adapting, and was steering her toward resilience rather than fear. Hayes leaned back in her chair, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights filling the office. She had served long enough to know when doctrine no longer matched reality. The rules said, no attachments, no personal ties, operatives survive alone. But the data told a different story. Sarah's stress indicators continued to fall. Her psychological health was stronger than ever. His involvement hadn't compromised her cover. If anything, it had strengthened it. Hayes scribbled a note in the margin of the report. Recommend controlled escalation. Test threshold. Sarah felt it immediately. The next time she entered the secure room, the atmosphere was different. Subtle changes. A second chair placed closer than before. Extra medical equipment, as if someone expected sessions to be longer, more intimate. She didn't mention it, but she saw notice too. "They're pushing," he murmured later when the session ended. Her pulse jumped. "Pushing what?" "Us," he said simply. "Seeing how far we'll go before we break." Her hands curled into fists. "We're not toys." "No," he agreed, "but to them we're data." The words chilled her. She had always known she was expendable, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone who cared for her made it sharper. That night back in her barracks, she sat on her bed, her ribs aching under the bandages, her heart heavier than her body. She had given everything to the program, her silence, her strength, her invisibility, and now even this fragile thread of connection was being measured, judged. For the first time she wondered, what if she refused? What if she pulled away from, retreated back into silence, their experiment? But then she remembered his words. Then let's give them something they can't terminate. And she realized she didn't want to retreat, not anymore. One evening, the threshold test arrived. It was disguised as routine, a therapy session like any other, worked along her shoulder, pressing into pressure points, his hands steady, his voice calm. But Sarah could feel the difference. Cameras were closer. The white noise hum had shifted. They wanted something. Halfway through, paused. His hand brushed against hers, lingering longer than necessary. The air thickened between them. Sarah froze. She knew what this was. A test. A deliberate push to see if she would break cover, if she would cross into vulnerability. Every instinct screamed to pull back, to protect herself. But's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. In that moment she made a choice. She didn't pull away. The silence stretched, not surveillance silence, not cover silence, something deeper, something real. When he finally stepped back, his expression gave nothing away. Professional, controlled, but she saw the flicker in his eyes. He had felt it too. And whoever was watching behind the cameras had seen it. Colonel Hayes received the report the next morning. The observation team had flagged the moment. It marked it as boundary breach. Hayes read it twice, then a third time. Boundary breach. That was the language they used when operatives crossed into dangerous territory. But the rest of the data told a different story. No spike in stress, no loss of discipline, no security lapses. In fact, Sarah's vitals had stabilized more quickly afterward. Focus had sharpened. Hayes tapped her pen against the desk. Then she underlined the word breach and wrote one word beside it. Strength. Sarah didn't know about the reports. She only knew the change in herself. The more she trusted, the less heavy her silence felt. For years, silence had been her shield, her way of surviving a world that demanded she vanish. Now, for the first time, silence felt like choice, shared, not forced. She found herself waiting for their sessions, not for the therapy, not even for the questions, but for the stillness between them, the kind that made her feel less alone. It scared her, terrified her in fact. She had been trained to see attachment as a crack in the armor, but with the cracks didn't feel like weakness. They felt like light. One night after a session that left her exhausted, Sarah lingered as packed up. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Do you ever get tired of being strong?" He looked up every day. She blinked, she hadn't expected that answer. Then why keep going? His expression softened. "Because someone has to, and if it isn't me, it's someone who might not survive it." She stared at him, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. He wasn't just a medic. He wasn't just a SEAL. He was someone who had carried too much for too long, just like her. For the first time, she whispered the truth she had never said aloud. "I don't want to carry it alone anymore." The room went still. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes, steady, unwavering, told her she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Far away in another secure facility, analysts marked the change. Martinez and increasing trust, increasing connection, no security compromise detected. One of them, a civilian in a gray suit, made a note in the margin. "Attachment not liability, possible operational model." The words would ripple upward, through channels Sarah would never see. But for now, in her small, guarded world, all she knew was that, for the first time since she was a girl hiding behind her bedroom door, silence no longer felt like prison. It felt like hope. The summons came without warning. Sarah had just finished morning drills, her ribs still aching under the bandages, when a runner handed her a slip of paper. Simple words, direct. "Report to conference room C 1400 hours, Colonel Hayes." Her pulse quickened. Conference room C wasn't a standard briefing space. It was a secure compartment, reserved for discussions that didn't exist on paper. The kind of room where lives could change in a single sentence. She folded the paper neatly, slipped it into her pocket, and forced herself to breathe evenly. But the old instincts returned, heavy and sharp. Silence, invisibility, control. By the time the clock struck 1400, Sarah walked into the room with her face composed, her posture perfect. Was already there, that startled her. He stood near the table, hands behind his back, eyes steady but wary. They weren't here for medical treatment. They were here because something had shifted. Colonel Hayes entered last. Crisp uniform, expression unreadable. She closed the door, sealed the locks, and stood at the head of the table. "Sit," she ordered. Sarah obeyed instantly, followed slower, deliberate. The silence stretched. Hayes led it. She studied them both, her eyes sharp enough to cut steel. Finally, she spoke. "You've both been under observation since the accident." Sarah's stomach tightened, didn't flinch. Hayes continued, her voice measured. "At first, I considered your interaction a potential liability. Attachment compromises operatives. That's doctrine." She paused, letting the word hang. "But then," Hayes said, her tone shifting, "the data told a different story. Martinez, your stress levels are lower than we've ever recorded. Your recovery time is ahead of schedule. Your operational readiness is improving despite your own injuries. Together, you've expectations." Sarah kept her face still, but inside her mind raced. Expectations. Was that praise or prelude to something else? Hayes leaned forward, her gaze narrowing. "You need to understand something. This isn't about you, not as individuals. It's about what you represent. An experiment, a model. What happens when two operatives are allowed connection?" The word dropped like a stone. Connection, not just a breach, not just a risk, a possibility. Spoke first, his voice calm. "You've been using us as a test case." Hayes didn't blink. "Yes." Sarah felt heat rise in her chest. "You had no right." I had every right, Hayes countered sharply. You signed away your right to privacy the day you accepted this program. You know that. Sarah's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, but the truth was undeniable. She had chosen this path, chosen secrecy, chosen sacrifice. Privacy was a luxury she had never been promised. But still, she hadn't expected this. Hayes's voice softened almost imperceptibly. You're angry, good. That means you still care about your autonomy, but hear me clearly, what you've built together has value, not weakness, not liability, value. She turned, clicking a remote. Screens lit up around the room, displaying graphs, charts, lines of data Sarah couldn't fully decipher. This, Hayes said, pointing to the rising curves, is Martinez before the accident, stressed, overextended, carrying too much silence. And this, she gestured to the higher numbers, is Martinez after working with better decision-making, faster recovery, higher stability. Sarah's chest tightened as she stared at the numbers. She hated them, hated how they made her humanity into data points, and yet she couldn't deny the truth behind them. Hayes turned off the screens. Here's the situation. We're considering formalizing what you've already created, a partnership. Martinez, your covert skills, your medical and operational support. Together, you'd form a new kind of team, one that challenges doctrine. Sarah blinked. She hadn't expected that. Formalizing partnership. Broke the silence, and if we refuse? Hayes's lips curved, not quite a smile. Then you go back to silence, alone, and everything you've built dies here. The room went still. Sarah's mind spun. For years she had believed strength meant carrying everything alone. But now Hayes was telling her the opposite. That connection had made her stronger. That maybe her silence wasn't survival anymore, maybe it was prison. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? That night Sarah walked alone across the base. The air was heavy, the sky blank with stars. She thought about Hayes's words, about the graphs, about sitting steady beside her as they were told their bond was being studied like a specimen under glass. She stopped near the parade ground, watching soldiers march in formation. Step by step, precise, disciplined, perfect. No deviation, no individuality. Was that all she was meant to be? Another step in someone else's formation? Or could she become something else, something uncharted, something dangerous, something alive? She heard footsteps approach. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the soldiers too. Finally he spoke. What are you thinking? She exhaled slowly. That I don't know who I am if I'm not silent. His head turned, eyes catching hers in the dim light. Maybe silence kept you alive, but it's not what's keeping you alive now. Her throat tightened. And what is? He didn't hesitate. Trust. The word landed like a blow. Trust. A word she had avoided her entire life. Trust meant risk. Trust meant vulnerability. Trust meant pain. And yet, standing beside him, she realized it also meant possibility. For the first time, she whispered it aloud. I'm scared. His gaze didn't waver. So am I. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, alive. And in that silence, Sarah realized she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Hayes received her own summons, a message from higher command. She entered another secure conference room, this one deeper underground, walls lined with steel. Two men were waiting, a Navy commander and a civilian in a gray suit. Their faces were unreadable. The civilian spoke first. Colonel Hayes, we've reviewed your reports. The Martinez dynamic is unprecedented. We're considering expanding the model. Hayes nodded slowly. They've shown resilience, mutual connection without compromise. I believe they can redefine operational support. The Navy commander frowned. Or they could implode. Attachments can cut both ways. Stronger together, yes, but also vulnerable if one falls. Hayes met his gaze evenly. Vulnerability is inevitable. Denying it hasn't worked. Maybe embracing it is the answer. The civilian leaned back, folding his hands. We'll give them one chance, a mission, together. If they succeed, the model moves forward. If they fail, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Hayes inclined her head. Understood. Back at the base, Sarah sat in the secure room waiting. She didn't know why she'd been called in again. She didn't know what was coming. But she felt it in her bones, the silence before a storm. The door opened. Hayes entered, a folder in her hand. She set it on the table, slid it toward them. Sarah stared at it, heart pounding. Orders. Opened it first, eyes scanning quickly. Then he slid it toward her. She read, her pulse raced, her breath caught. A mission, together. Her first thought was fear. If they failed, everything ended. Not just the program, not just the partnership, them. Her second thought was something she hadn't felt in years, something she barely recognized. Hope. The orders sat on the table like a weight. Sarah's fingers hovered just above the folder, trembling despite her steady face. The mission details were sparse, written in clipped military phrasing that hid more than it revealed. Location redacted, objective vague, short. But one line stood out, sharp and undeniable. Assigned operatives, Martinez S.M. Together. Sarah closed the folder slowly, as if afraid that even the sound of paper might shatter the fragile ground beneath her feet. She had imagined many endings to her career: injury, exposure, disappearance. But not this. Not a sanctioned partnership that dared to make visible what had been hidden for months. Broke the silence first, his voice calm, even. So they've decided. Sarah's throat tightened. They've decided to use us. He shook his head slightly. No, they've decided to trust us. She stared at him, searching his face for doubt, for hesitation. But his eyes were steady, clear. And in that moment, she realized something that scared her more than the mission itself. She wanted to believe him. Preparation began immediately. Their schedules shifted, their days consumed by drills and joint exercises. What startled Sarah most wasn't the training itself. She had lived through far worse, but the way it was tailored. Every scenario paired them. Every drill tested not just individual skill but cooperation, covering angles, anticipating movements, communication without words. The first time they stumbled, she moved left when he expected right. He reached for equipment she had already secured. Tiny missteps, but in their world, tiny missteps killed. Afterward, Sarah sat on the floor of the training bay, sweat dripping down her temples, ribs aching under the pressure of exertion. "We'll never make it work," she muttered. Crouched in front of her, steady, unflinching. "Yes, we will." "How can you be so sure?" "Because," he said simply, "you already trust me more than you trust yourself." Her breath caught. She wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh at the arrogance, but she couldn't because it was true. At night, back in her barracks, Sarah wrestled with memories of Texas, of silence, of learning to disappear so completely that even her family forgot she was in the room. She had carried that invisibility into the army, into the program, into every mission. It was her shield, her survival. But now she was being asked to do the opposite, to be seen, to move in sync with someone else, to let someone hold half the weight she had always carried alone. The thought terrified her, and yet when she closed her eyes, she saw a steady gaze, his calm presence, the way he never flinched from her silence but filled it with something else, something she had no name for yet. Maybe it wasn't weakness, maybe it was strength. Colonel Hayes monitored every report, each training session, each psychological evaluation. The data fascinated her. Where most pairs fractured under pressure, Sarah and sharpened. Their mistakes grew fewer, their timing quicker, their silence louder, not empty, but full of unspoken understanding. Hayes wrote a note to herself late one night. "They're not defying doctrine, they're rewriting it." But she didn't share that observation. Not yet. The higher command wanted results, not philosophy, and results would only come in the field. 2 weeks before deployment, Sarah and sat alone in the secure room. The air was heavy with the hum of white noise. "Tell me what scares you most," said suddenly. She blinked. "Why?" "Because if I know your fear, I can cover it, same way you cover mine." Her throat tightened. Fear. She had never said it aloud, not to anyone. Fear was weakness. Fear was silence. But now she inhaled slowly, ribs aching, and whispered, "Losing myself, becoming nothing but the mission, so invisible that I forget who I am." The words cracked something inside her. She had never admitted it, not even to herself. Didn't speak right away. He just nodded, as if the confession wasn't weakness but truth. Then he said softly, "My fear, that I'll fail someone who trusted me, that I'll watch them fall and know it was my hands that should held them up." Their eyes met across the sterile table, and in that moment Sarah realized something extraordinary. Their fears fit together. Each could shield the other. Maybe that was the point. The night before deployment, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bunk, lacing and unlacing her boots, heart pounding with the weight of tomorrow. Her mind replayed every moment of the past weeks, the drills, the silence, the tests. The way Hayes's eyes had studied them like pieces on a chessboard. The way's voice had steadied her when she wanted to collapse. She thought about what waited ahead. Missions never came with guarantees, not of success, not of survival, and this experiment, carried risks she couldn't calculate. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her knees, whispering into the quiet, "Don't disappear, not this time." Deployment day arrived with no ceremony. Just orders, gear, and the low rumble of a transport plane waiting on the tarmac. Sarah and walked side by side, silence heavy but steady. Soldiers bustled around them, unaware of the weight they carried. To the outside world, they were just another team boarding another flight. But to Sarah, every step felt like crossing a line she could never return from. At the plane's ramp, glanced at her, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Ready." Her ribs ached, her shoulder throbbed, her heart pounded, but she nodded. "Always." As they stepped into the plane's belly, the noise of engines swallowed their words. The door closed behind them. The world of fort, of waiting rooms, sterile halls, and silent experiments fell away. Ahead lay something else, something uncharted. Sarah gripped the strap of her pack, steadying herself as the engines roared. She felt beside her, close enough that even without looking, she knew he was there. And for the first time in her life, stepping into the unknown didn't feel like disappearing. It felt like becoming. Colonel Hayes stood on the tarmac, watching the plane lift into the gray sky. She didn't move until the aircraft disappeared into the clouds. Then she whispered to no one but herself, "Don't fail me now." She wasn't speaking to Sarah, not to. She was speaking to the idea they carried, the possibility that strength didn't have to mean silence, and connection didn't have to mean compromise. For the first time in her long career, Hayes allowed herself a sliver of hope. In the belly of the transport plane, Sarah leaned back against the rattling wall, eyes closed. The hum of the engines matched the hum of her thoughts. She remembered Texas. She remembered silence. She remembered every moment she had survived by staying unseen. And then she remembered the hospital waiting room, the sling, the bandages, the SEAL medic who had asked the one question she couldn't ignore. She opened her eyes, was sitting across from her, arms folded, steady gaze meeting hers. No words passed between them, none were needed. For the first time in years, Sarah Martinez wasn't just a shadow. She was part of something bigger. And as the plane carried them toward the unknown, she realized, sometimes survival isn't about silence. Sometimes it's about trust. The transport plane touched down in darkness. No runway lights, no welcoming convoy, just the crunch of rubber on dirt and the hiss of engines cooling in the night air. Sarah stepped out first, boots sinking into soft earth. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, carrying the scent of soil and diesel. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and then silence fell again, as if the land itself held its breath. Followed, packs slung across his shoulder. Their escort was minimal, two figures in plain fatigues, faces unreadable, weapons slung low. They offered no names, only a brief nod before leading the way. Sarah kept her steps measured, her senses sharp. She had been in enough shadow operations to know the pattern: arrive unseen, move silently, vanish without trace. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. There was buried deep in the outskirts of a crumbling town. Concrete walls by age, windows barred, the hum of a single generator breaking the night's stillness. Inside, maps littered the table, red circles, black arrows, targets and routes sketched in blunt strokes. Sarah studied the documents, her jaw tightening. The mission was straightforward on paper: gather intelligence on a weapons network moving through civilian channels, identify leaders, secure evidence, extract. But she knew better. Nothing was straightforward in the field. What was written in clean ink would bleed into chaos in reality. Leaned over the map, his voice low. We've got two insertion points. North perimeter's cleaner but longer. South perimeter's faster but exposed. Sarah traced the routes with her finger, her mind calculating, adjusting. Finally, she said, North. Always take time over risk. He glanced at her, even if time costs opportunity. She met his eyes, steady. Opportunity means nothing if you're dead. He nodded, as if confirming what he already knew. For 3 days they observed, moving silently through alleys, rooftops, abandoned lots. Sarah melted into shadows with practiced ease, her silence once again her weapon. Covered angles, his movements steady, his presence a constant behind her shoulder. They spoke little, communicating in gestures, glances, the language of trust. And slowly a pattern emerged. Trucks arriving at odd hours. Men moving crates too heavy for food, too discreet for aid. Conversations in coded phrases. One night, perched on the rooftop of a half-collapsed building, Sarah whispered for the first time in hours. They're moving something tomorrow, East Road, midnight. Adjusted his binoculars, confirming, we'll be there. The decision was unspoken. This was their moment. Midnight arrived with rain. Heavy, relentless, drumming on rooftops, turning dirt into mud. Sarah pulled her hood low, water dripping into her eyes as she crouched in the shadows near the road. Beside her, adjusted his earpiece, voice barely audible over the downpour. 2 trucks, 10 men, armed. She nodded, heart steady despite the storm. The headlights appeared first, twin beams cutting through sheets of rain. Engines growled, gears grinding against wet stone. The convoy rolled closer, unaware of the 2 shadows waiting in silence. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was the test, not drills, not data, reality. The first truck slowed, tires sinking into mud. A soldier jumped down, scanning the road. His flashlight beam cut dangerously close to their hiding spot. Sarah held her breath, her hand brushing the pistol at her side. If he came closer, silence would break in an instant. But then's hand touched her arm, light, steady, grounding. Wait, it said, trust. She froze, trusting the signal. The soldier's light swept past them, moved on. He climbed back into the truck, muttering. The convoy rolled forward again. Sarah exhaled slowly, the storm masking the sound. She had been seconds away from action, but had been right. Trust had kept them unseen. They followed the trucks, moving through mud and shadows until the convoy reached an abandoned warehouse. Inside, the crates were offloaded, weapons gleaming under dim bulbs. Sarah's camera clicked silently, capturing evidence. Whispered coordinates into the encrypted comms, sending the data into the void. But then it happened. A slip, a noise. Not from them, from the collapsing floorboard under his boot. A single crack echoed through the warehouse. Heads turned, guns raised, shouts filled the air. "Move," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. They bolted, rain swallowing their footsteps as bullets tore into the night. Wood splintered, metal rang. The warehouse erupted behind them. Sarah's lungs burned as she sprinted, mud dragging at her boots. Was just behind, his breath ragged, his pack bouncing against his back. They dove into an alley, pressing against the wall as shouts echoed closer. Sarah's chest heaved. "We're compromised." Wiped rain from his eyes, his jaw tight. "Then we finish it fast." The next hour blurred into chaos. Pursuit through alleys, gunfire slicing the rain, Sarah's ribs screaming with every movement. She fired sparingly, each shot precise, calculated. Covered angles dragging her out of danger more than once. At one point, cornered in a narrow street, Sarah thought it was over. 3 men advanced, rifles raised. Her pistol clicked empty. Her body ached, exhausted. And then stepped forward, calm, steady. He fired 3 times, each shot clean, each target falling. Sarah stared at him in the darkness, rain streaming down his face. For the first time, she wasn't the invisible one saving others. She was the one being saved. And she hated it and needed it all at once. They made it back to the at dawn, soaked, battered, but alive. The evidence secured. The mission complete. Sarah sat on the floor, head against the wall, every muscle trembling. Knelt beside her, checking her ribs, his hands gentle but firm. "You're hurt worse than you let on," he muttered. She tried to shake her head. "I can manage." His eyes hardened. "Stop, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, wanted to retreat into silence. But the memory of his hand steadying hers in the storm, the sound of his gun saving her life, the truth of his presence, it broke through. For the first time, Sarah whispered words she had never allowed herself to say. "I don't know how to be strong with someone else." His hand stilled on her ribs. His voice was quiet, certain. "Then let me show you." The silence that followed was heavy, not with fear, but with something new, something fragile, something dangerous. And Sarah realized this was the true mission, not the evidence, not the weapons, not the chase. But learning how to trust, how to fight without disappearing, how to be seen and still survive. Far away in another secure facility, Colonel Hayes received the encrypted report. Mission successful, evidence secured, operatives alive. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. They had survived the storm. More importantly, they had survived it together. Hayes wrote a final note in the margin of the report. Partnership validated. Proceed to expansion. As the sun rose over the crumbling town, Sarah sat at the window, rain finally breaking into weak light. Sat nearby, silent, steady, a presence she no longer feared. For the first time, Sarah Martinez didn't feel like the wounded, invisible soldier hiding in silence. She felt like something more. And as the light broke through the clouds, she whispered to herself, "Not alone, not anymore." The extraction came at dawn. A blacked-out vehicle rolled into the alley, headlights off, engine low. Sarah and climbed in without a word, mud still clinging to their boots, exhaustion etched into their faces. The driver said nothing, only nodded once and drove into the waking horizon. They vanished behind them, swallowed by rain and silence. Sarah sat rigid, eyes fixed on the blurred world beyond the window. Every muscle in her body ached, her ribs screaming with each breath, but she refused to let it show. Old habits, old silence. Beside her, leaned back against the seat, steady, his presence a quiet anchor. He didn't speak either. Their silence wasn't empty, it was heavy with what they had survived. Back at the base, debriefing was swift, clinical. Reports filed, evidence, every detail dissected under the cold, fluorescent lights of a secure conference room. Colonel Hayes presided, her eyes sharp, her expression unreadable. "You completed the mission," she said simply. "Despite compromise, despite pursuit, the evidence is intact. That's what matters." Sarah's jaw clenched. "And the dead men in the streets, do they matter?" A flicker crossed Hayes's face, surprise, maybe even respect, but her voice stayed firm. "They matter only as obstacles removed. Don't confuse necessity with sentiment." Sarah held her gaze, unflinching. Once she might have swallowed her words, vanished into silence, but not anymore. "They weren't obstacles," she said quietly. "They were men, and their blood is on my hands too." The room fell still. Spoke then, his voice steady but edged with steel. "What you're asking us to do isn't mechanical. It costs. Pretending otherwise is dangerous." Hayes's eyes shifted between them, studying not their words but their unity. Finally, she leaned back. "Noted." The word was curt, but Sarah sensed it meant more than it revealed. After the debrief, Sarah walked alone across the base, rain still clinging to the air. The mission had been a success on paper, but inside something churned. Every face she had seen in the storm, every sound of bullets ripping into night, every choice she had made. Silence had once been her refuge, her shield, but now it was filled with echoes she couldn't escape. She found herself at the edge of the parade ground, soldiers drilling in perfect formation. Their steps precise, their movements synchronized, their individuality erased. For years she had believed strength meant fitting into that formation, becoming invisible, carrying the weight without complaint. Now she wondered if strength was something else entirely. Lost in thought, his voice broke through, calm, steady. She turned to find him standing behind her, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes searching hers. "I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Good. That means you're finally asking the right question." Over the following weeks, Sarah and trained together again, this time not under observation, not as an experiment. Their partnership had been validated. Hayes had said so herself. Now they were simply preparing for what came next. But Sarah noticed the shift. Every drill, every exercise, every mission plan. They moved not as two operatives forced together, but as one unit, sharpened by fire and trust. It was frightening, it was liberating. And for the first time, Sarah didn't fear being seen. One evening, after a long day of training, Sarah sat across from in the secure room. The hum of white noise filled the silence. She spoke first. "Hayes used us from the beginning." Nodded, "Yes." "And we let her." "Yes." Her eyes narrowed. "Does that bother you?" He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "It only bothers me if we stop owning it. We didn't just survive their experiment, Sarah. We rewrote it, on our terms." She felt the words settle in her chest, heavy and true. For years she had lived by someone else's script, a shadow in a program that didn't exist. Now, for the first time, she felt like the author of her own story. The turning point came when Hayes summoned them again. This time her tone was different, less clinical, more deliberate. "We're moving forward with the model," she said. "Your partnership will serve as the prototype. Other operatives will follow. You'll set the standard." Sarah's pulse quickened. Prototype, standard, words that once would have felt like chains. Now they felt like something else, a chance, a responsibility. Hayes studied them for a long moment before speaking again. "You've proven that silence doesn't always equal strength. That connection can be resilience. But remember this, connection also creates vulnerability. Enemies will use it, exploit it. You must be prepared." Sarah held her gaze unflinching. "We are." His voice followed, calm and certain. "Together." Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She only nodded. 3 months later, the world blurred again. New orders, new mission, new shadows to step into. But something had changed. Sarah no longer walked alone into the unknown. As their plane lifted off, engines roaring, she sat beside, the silence between them steady, alive. no longer heavy with isolation but filled with trust. She thought back to Texas, to the quiet girl who had hidden from her father's rage, who had survived by disappearing. She thought back to the waiting room, her arm in a sling, ribs bandaged, believing she was nothing more than a wounded, invisible soldier. And she thought of now. The woman boarding this plane wasn't invisible. She wasn't silent. She was seen, she was trusted, she was strong not despite connection but because of it. She turned to, her voice low but steady. "Do you ever think about what this costs?" His eyes met hers, calm as always, every day. "And you're not afraid?" "I am," he said softly, "but I'd rather carry fear with you than silence without you." The engines roared louder, drowning the rest of the world. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes, letting the hum settle into her bones. For the first time in her life, she felt whole. Not the wounded soldier, not the silent shadow, but a partner, a survivor, a woman who had found strength not in silence but in trust. And as the plane disappeared into the horizon, Sarah Martinez whispered the words she had once thought she'd never say. "I'm not afraid anymore.